In this section, we'll compare cardiac muscle and smooth muscle to skeletal muscle. As you'll find, cardiac and smooth muscle have special structural and physiological properties that are related to their distinctive functions, but they also have properties in common with each other. Any of the three types of muscle cells can be called myocytes. When we refer to cardiac and smooth muscle, it's preferable to call them all myocytes rather than muscle fibers, because these two types of cells do not have long, fibrous shape of skeletal muscle. They're relatively short, and they have only one nucleus. Both types of muscle are involuntary muscle tissues, and they're not usually subject to conscious control. However, it is known that we can consciously control our heart rate, and probably we can consciously control some of our other visceral muscles. Let's begin by looking at cardiac muscle. It's limited to the heart. Here, it helps function to pump the blood through the circulatory vessels. It has thus some required properties. It needs to contract with a regular rhythm, and the muscle cells of each chamber must contract in unison. These contractions have got to last long enough to expel blood, and they need to work whether we're asleep or awake, without fail and without conscious attention. They also obviously need to be highly resistant to fatigue. Cardiac muscle cells are striated like skeletal muscle, but the myocytes or cardiocytes are much shorter and thicker. Each myocyte is joined to several others at uneven notched linkages called intercalated discs that we reviewed during our section on tissues. These appear as thick, dark lines in the stained tissue sections. They communicate with each other through gap junctions that actually allow electrical signals to be passed from one cell to the other, so they stimulate their neighbors. Cardiac muscles are very adaptable with respect to their fuel they use, and because they need to function constantly, they're very vulnerable to interruptions in oxygen supply. In smooth muscle, there's also only one nucleus, and it's located near the middle of the cell. There are no visible striations in smooth muscle. However, they do still have the thick and thin filaments that we see in skeletal muscle, but they're not aligned with each other in organization like the sarcomere. They have no Z discs. The Z discs are replaced by Dens bodies, which are protein masses that are around the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm contains extensive cytoskeletal elements of intermediate filaments. These elements attach to the membrane plaques and the Dens bodies and help the cell maintain its shape. The sarcoplasmic reticulum of smooth muscle is very scanty, and there are no T-tubules. However, calcium is still necessary for muscle contraction, but it comes from the extracellular fluid by way of calcium channels in the sarcolemma or cell membrane. Some smooth muscles lack any nerve supply at all, while others receive some autonomic fibers. The cells of smooth muscle tissue are capable of mitosis and hyperplasia. Thus, injured muscle tissue regenerates very well. There are two main types of smooth muscle. There's multi-unit smooth muscle and single-unit smooth muscle. In multi-unit smooth muscle, the autonomic innervation is similar to that of skeletal muscle, where we have terminal branches of one nerve fiber synapsing with many individual myocytes to form a motor unit. Each motor unit contracts independently of the others. This type of tissue occurs in some of the largest arteries and the pulmonary air passages, as well as in the piloerector muscles of the hair follicle and the iris of the eye. This multi-unit smooth muscle name comes from the fact that each motor unit contracts independently of the others. When we look at single-unit smooth muscle, we'll see that the myocytes of this cell type are electrically coupled to each other through gap junctions. Thus, they directly stimulate each other, and a large number of cells will contract as a single unit, which is why we call it single-unit smooth muscle. This muscle fiber type is much more widespread. It occurs in most blood vessels in the digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. We also call this type of muscle visceral muscle. It's arranged in two layers, where there's an inner circle of fibers and then an outer layer of longitudinal fibers that run in completely the opposite direction. Smooth muscle is predominantly involuntary and can contract without any nervous stimulation. It can contract in response to chemical stimuli, hormones, carbon dioxide, low pH, as well as oxygen deficiency. In response to stretch, the smooth muscle cells will also contract. A single unit smooth muscle in the stomach and intestines also has pacemaker cells that set off waves of contraction throughout the entire muscle layer. Smooth muscle is innervated by autonomic nerve fibers. These can trigger and modify the contractions that are endogenous to the muscle tissue itself. They stimulate the smooth muscle with either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, depending on the function of that muscle. In single unit smooth muscle, each autonomic fiber has up to 20,000 bead-like swellings on it called varicosities. These varicosities contain synaptic vesicles and a few mitochondria. The nerve fiber passes amid several different myocytes and is able to stimulate all of them when it releases the neurotransmitter from the varicosity. Smooth muscle resembles the other muscle types in that its contraction is triggered by calcium and energized by ATP. And it's also achieved by the sliding of thin filaments over thick filaments. The mechanism of excitation, contraction, and coupling is a little bit different. Very little calcium comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum because there isn't much of it. And the contraction and relaxation is very slow when compared to skeletal muscle. In skeletal muscle, the latent period is about 2 milliseconds. However, in smooth muscle, it can be up to 100 milliseconds. And the tension will peak at about 500 milliseconds. And then it takes 1 to 2 seconds for that tension to decline. Can you imagine if our skeletal muscles worked that slowly? The ATPase and the calcium pumps are also much slower in function than the ones we see in skeletal muscle. As the thick filaments of smooth muscle pull across the thin ones, the thin filaments pull on the dense bodies as well as membrane plaques. Through the dense bodies and cytoskeleton, force is transferred to the plasma membrane and the entire cell shortens. When the smooth muscle cell contracts, it tends to pucker and twist, and it looks somewhat like wringing out a dish sponge. On the right here, you can see some relaxed smooth muscles and some contracted smooth muscle cells. This latch bridge mechanism is very resistant to fatigue. This means the heads of the myosin don't detach from the actin immediately, so they hold the contraction for longer, and thus they don't consume any more ATP. Stretch alone in smooth muscle can sometimes cause contraction. It causes the opening of mechanically gated calcium channels in the sarcolemma. This lets in calcium and thus causes a contraction. The waves of contraction that are brought about by food that distends the esophagus or feces that distend the colon elicit these types of contractions. They're called peristalsis, and they act to propel contents through the organ. When smooth muscle is stretched, it can also exhibit a stress relaxation response. It contracts briefly and resists and then relaxes. This is imperative for an organ like the bladder. It allows the organ to gradually fill. Imagine if it had this peristalsis effect where the urinary bladder filled and then the muscle contracted strongly against it. The bladder would not be able to fill without us urinating without control. So when it's stretched, the tissue briefly contracts and then it relaxes, and it briefly contracts and it relaxes. This prevents emptying while filling. Skeletal muscle can't contract forcefully if it's overstretched. However, smooth muscles can contract forcefully even when they're very greatly stretched. They can be anywhere from half to twice as long as their resting length and still contract very powerfully. The reasons for this are that there are no Z discs, so the thick filaments cannot butt against them to stop the contraction. And since the thick and thin filaments are not arranged in orderly sarcomeres, the stretching does not cause a situation where there's too little overlap for the cross bridges to form. The thick filaments of smooth muscle also have myosin heads along their entire length, so cross bridges can form anywhere. The ability of smooth muscle to adjust its tension to the degree of stretch is called plasticity. Again, in the bladder, it can be greatly stretched, yet not become flabby and wrinkly when it's empty. Due to this plasticity, its return to normal shape. So this concludes our chapter on muscular physiology. Spend a moment here to review the structures and functions of cardiac and smooth muscle. I know the coverage has been brief, but we'll certainly cover it in more detail as we go through the various organ systems next semester.